Hey guys, wanted to talk to you about my population presentation and um, my mine is on multiracial populations. So here we go. Challenges unique to multiracial individuals. This is something that honestly, as a white person, a middle-aged white person, I never had really thought much about. Um, so there's several different things that people that come from a multicultural background or multiracial background have to deal with. Racial and ethnic ambiguity. They're not quite sure where they fit in. They don't really fit into this community, but they don't really fit into this community. So, for example, if it's an Asian and African American individual, they're not really sure that they fit into the Asian stereotypes, but they're not really sure that they fit into the African American stereotypes either. So, that's a little bit of an issue. Existing between the two margins, not really belonging to any margin. You're too dark for the white people, but you're too light for the dark people, for the African American people. So, they don't really have anywhere that they truly feel that they belong sometimes. Intermarriage, stereotypes, and myths. One of the myths that I read about, which I found very interesting, was that the assumption that just because an individual is multiracial doesn't mean they can't be dealing with some of the same issues and problems that people that are monoracial deal with. So that's something that, I think that as counselors we're going to need to keep in the forefront of our mind while being cognizant of where they're at in the stage of development, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, and with the things that are going on around them, but also being cognizant that they're humans and that they may have the same struggles that every other human has as well. Discrimination and racism is a challenge that's not necessarily unique to multiracial individuals, but it is a challenge that they face. I think all marginalized individuals deal with this, so it's not particularly unique, but I felt like it was worth mentioning. And then the final thing that I found that it had never even entered my mind, is this having the right to self-identify. Um, Myself, as a middle-aged white woman, does not have the right to tell a multiracial individual, oh, well, you belong to the African American community, or you belong to the Asian community, or you belong to the white community, just based on their physical features. That's really doesn't belong to anybody but the individual. So that empowerment of self-identifying is something that I think is very, very important that we as counselors recognize. So I found this 5 stages of identity development in an article by Evans and Ramsey. And there were many other models out there, but I particularly liked this one because I felt like it would be something that would be easy for the layperson to understand. It was kind of plain English. So I wanted to bring it to my presentation. And so personal identity. Individual is aware of their racial identity, unaware, I'm sorry, of their racial identity. So sometimes in the early developmental stages, individuals may not even be aware of their racial identity. They haven't been exposed to other races. What they know is normal is all they know. And then once they get a little bit older and they start going to preschool or join brownies or join the dance team or whatever it is, gymnastics, karate, soccer, they start to see other individuals and they're exposed to more and more. And they might feel like they have to identify with a specific racial orientation, like, oh, this is where I'm going to fit in, or oh, this is where I'm going to fit in. So after that step, you have this denial phase where they might decide that they're going to overcompensate. And so they're only going to follow the African American side of their culture or their heritage, or they might only choose to follow the Native American side of their culture or heritage, depending on which environment that particular need fills. So after that, they have appreciation, and that's where they start to understand that there really is some value to all of their cultural heritage. I think a lot of these stages, from what I read, comes with the maturity of the individual, but it also has to do with life experiences as well. And then finally, hopefully, they come to a place where they can appreciate and incorporate all or both of their races, so that they don't feel that guilt or that sense of burden for only acknowledging basically half of who they are.
I'm what Hollywood would call ethnically ambiguous.
When people first glance at me, I mean, the first thing they see is a white guy, and usually I'll have to end up explaining to people that I am half Mexican and half white.
No one has ever been able to correctly identify who I am my entire life.
I've gotten Cuban, Puerto Rican, Dominican, half black, half white.
People think I'm Asian.
Egyptian, Polynesian, Asian.
Fully white or fully Asian.
Almost everyone misreads me in some way. It's very hard to guess Danish and Indian from a first glance.
I've honestly heard everything.
Sometimes I wish I could walk in and just like be recognized as like a Mexican American.
Sometimes people will come up to me on the street and like start speaking Spanish frantically, and I can't respond because I don't speak Spanish.
I find that depending on where I am, people read me differently.
They tend to think that I'm whatever they are. People of a Hispanic background think I'm Hispanic. People who are Asian think I look Asian.
An interesting part of my journey as a young multiracial person growing up was rejection from sort of both sides of my ethnic identity.
Just something that I grew up with my whole life. Like, I don't fit in. I don't belong to any ethnic group 100%.
I never saw myself as different from anybody else until someone else pointed it out.
The last thing you want to do is stand out. You want to blend in as much as possible.
We talk about race like it's this like built-in intrinsic thing, but the reality is we're mostly talking about looks, right?
If I'm going to be white, well, then why can't I have blonde hair and blue eyes? If I'm going to be Mexican, then why can't I have dark skin and speak perfect Spanish? People think I'm Asian. Why can't I have, be really tiny and skinny and like fit into all these stereotypes? But I'm not a stereotype. I'm just like me.
And for mixed people who sort of live in between the lines, we sort of just have to kind of be more than our racial background.
You don't need to fit a mold that other people think you should fit.
It's difficult learning that you don't have to decide what race you are.
There's no textbook on how to be multiracial and be okay with it. You just kind of have to forge ahead and be your own person.
I am who I am, and no one else is like me, and that's pretty cool.
So I chose to include that little clip because, earlier I talked about that racial ambiguity, and I looked through several videos, and I found that this one kind of very succinctly described what people of all different types of multiracial backgrounds dealt with. And so, a couple of things that stood out to me is I don't really fit in. There is no textbook for how to be a multiracial individual. So I found that a little disturbing, just because I don't think that it's something that those of us that are monoracial even think about, honestly. Okay, so the history of marginalization. I really struggled finding a lot about the history of marginalization of mixed racial individuals. However, what I did find was fascinating. I had never really thought about it, but when our forefathers came over on their boats, so to speak, it was a bunch of white men. That's who came over. That's who explored the land. You think of Lewis and Clark, and you think of all of these explorers. They were all white men. They didn't bring, their wives or anything with them at first. They just came and they come over and they settled the land. So they were really the first to start marginalizing these mixed racial individuals, because they came over, and a lot of the relationships they had with either the Native Americans or the enslaved Africans that came up later, they weren't voluntary. There was, rape and servitude, and they had no basic human rights, a lot of these women. And so that's probably where I envision this marginalization beginning. In 1967, Loving versus Virginia gave people of different races legitimacy. When I think about that, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's like literally 50 years ago. 50 years ago is when we decided as a country that people that were biracial were legitimate. Like when I read that, I was like, for real? Like, you for real right now? 50 years ago. And then another marginalization issue that I found that recurred commonly was dealing with the children of biracial, the children, the offspring of these multiracial individuals. They didn't really have a where to fit either, just like their parents. So, even if they were a quarter of a marginalized population or an eighth of a marginalized population, we'll talk about the one drop rule here in just a second, but it's just really, really, really strange that from the very minute that, the settlers landed on this land, multiracial individuals started being marginalized. So the thing that I found the most interesting about the history of the psychology of multiracial populations is that there really isn't that much history. Again, going back 50 years to 1967, that's when this these multiracial individuals finally gained legitimacy through the Supreme Court, and so there really hasn't been a whole lot of research. There hasn't been a whole lot of psychological theories devoted to these individuals. I finally found an article that basically studied the articles or the studies that had been done. And one of the most fascinating things I found was just the lack of education, the lack of studies, the lack of psychological theories to deal with these particular populations. So I found that very, very interesting. History of distrust of the system. As I mentioned earlier, distrust of multiracial individuals goes all the way back from the minute that settlers stepped foot on this land, and the Native Americans and the enslaved African Americans were marginalized. They were assaulted. They were, had their rights taken away. That would in and of itself be enough to make these multiracial individuals distrust the systems. But then if you also add the census forms until 2000, you had to pick a side. You couldn't check more than one box. You couldn't check other, and that was 17 years ago. So that's within the lifetime of my oldest child, my youngest child. I'm sorry. So that stresses me out just a little bit. My nephew is multiracial, so I have seen that with him when we went to help my sister-in-law enroll him in school. There was white or black or Asian but there was no other, even on the school forms. And, he's 17 years old. So, that's a little bit, obviously, makes them distrust the system a little bit when they can't even fully state what is their culture, what is their race or their ethnicity. And then I found it extremely disturbing, although I don't know why it shocked me, but it did. Groups such as the NAACP also make comments like it dilutes the strength of their constituencies when you have multiracial individuals joining. So, these are all just a drop in the bucket of reasons why multiracial individuals would distrust the system. Just over and over again, they've been ignored. They have been cast aside. They've been forced to choose a side. Even the NAACP doesn't necessarily acknowledge or find value in members that are multiracial. So all of this is a little disturbing. I'm not going to even lie. Characteristics and strengths. I'm going to go over the strengths first because I think that something that's really, really cool about multiracial individuals is that they do get to see several different cultural communities. So they have more of a wealth of background knowledge than I would ever have. And I think that is definitely a strength and an advantage. Um, if they've been raised in an environment that acknowledges both of the races or all of the races, if they're more than one or mean more than two, then they have the ability to see issues from different sides. Characteristics of multiracial individuals: they're the fastest growing population in the United States, which, considering they're the least studied population in the United States, according to the article I read, that's a little odd to me. So hopefully that will change. Most multiracial individuals tend to identify with one of their races. They don't tend to identify with both. So, especially like when they're checking the boxes on forms, which is interesting to me. Now, I mentioned earlier this one drop of blood rule. In 1894, there was a Supreme Court decision that basically said, even if you as a multiracial individual are so far diluted, maybe you're only an eighth African American or an eighth Native American, our country is going to assign you to the least desirable racial heritage. A lot has changed since then, but we still have a long way to go. That was, 100 plus years ago. But still, I think even now in 2017, we still tend to do that. We still tend to see people as the marginalized population as opposed to the majority population. Counseling to do's and to don'ts. Educate, educate, educate. I feel like education is probably the most important thing that we need to do when it comes to multiracial individuals. Knowing our clients and their specific needs and their specific backgrounds, I think is probably equally as important. Become aware of our own personal bias, which is something for me personally I'm learning, especially through this class. I'm seeing all kinds of things that that I just took for granted, and that I need to do better and to be better. So I think that's something that's important to me personally. See the client as a whole person. Don't focus on the client as an African American or as a Hispanic American or as a white American. Focus on them as an entire person, which to me, I feel like that kind of goes for all of our clients, because all of our clients are going to have different issues, whether it's a multiracial issue or whether it's a, all different kinds of issues. So I think clients in general, we need to focus on as a whole person. Identify resources that can help our clients and provide them with some tools. In just a minute, I'm going to talk about, what kind of interventions and strategies. So, providing them with the tools that they need would be very important. And then also the last to do is stressing those positive attributes of being multiracial. I think that's super important. Things not to do. Assume that there's a one-size-fits-all model when counseling multiracial clients. Over the past couple weeks, the chapters that have been assigned in our book and this chapter as well, I've learned a lot about how these are general guidelines, so to speak. These are not the end-all, be-all fixes to the solution. Again, I think that kind of goes with all of our clients, but particularly with our multiracial clients. Don't make assumptions or fall into stereotypes. Again, that goes back to the counseling do of getting to know your client, getting to know their background, getting to know their needs. And then finally, probably the biggest don't that I feel like is the most important is don't take for granted that their feelings are not real. Their feelings of guilt for maybe not acknowledging a particular culture group that is related to them, or their feelings of rejection. Again, they're not dark enough to fit into the African American group, but they're not light enough to fit into the white group, or they're not small enough to fit into the Asian group, or whatever the case may be. These are real. These are things that our multiracial individuals deal with all the time. So it's important to acknowledge and not to minimize those things. So interventions. I felt really, really good when I was reading interventions and things that we could do to help our clients. Family counseling is something that all of the articles that I read suggested for multiracial clients. They felt that counseling those from multiracial families could be really beneficial. I feel like it would also help you know your client, because as their family comes in, you could kind of see, see different perspective of where they're coming from. As a teacher, I see that with my students a lot as well. If I'm having an issue with a student, it's always good to call the family, and a lot of times that explains a lot of the situation. Provide support at school. This was the most exciting thing to me, because our school does not currently offer any programs for multiracial individuals. So as a prospective counselor, that's something that I feel very strongly we need to implement, whether it be study groups, whether it be support groups, whether it be lunch and learns where they can kind of get together and kind of have a commonality. I think that's something really important at PBJHS, and I'm really gonna make that happen. Reality therapy, that's my personal choice of therapy. It kind of fits my personality the best, and I feel like reality therapy would be really good with this particular group, because it's providing them the tools to make the changes that they would like to see. And I think life is all about a series of choices. And I feel like if we provide them with the tools to help them, make some choices and make some changes, and, hopefully come to those desired results, I feel like I can really make some differences with my clients. One thing that I just found out about, literally like day before yesterday, as I was preparing to do this project, is this eco map. I'm definitely going to look into this, because it's very interesting to me that you kind of want to find out, where does the client stand with their relationships, with their values, with what are the influences in their life, whether it be peer influence. So kind of finding out what kind of ecological map you can make with these students to help them kind of draw some conclusions. Again, I think that goes back to giving them tools, and the more tools we can give them, the better equipped they'll be, in my opinion. And then understanding and applying those strategies that I talked about earlier in regards to the development of these multiracial clients. I think that's really, really important. Advocacy and resources. I personally am going to advocate at Poplar Bluff Junior High, if I'm lucky enough to be put in a position of counselor, to start providing some support services for multiracial individuals. Start getting the knowledge out there. Talk to fellow teachers about the issues that these students may or may not encounter. Talk to them about the developmental stages of someone that comes from a multiracial background. Project RACE is a group that I found that is all about trying to do away with having to check one box on forms. Adding that multiracial box. Adding being able to check more than one box, I think is very important, and that's something that Project RACE is working on. Mixed Like Us is a resource that I actually used for part of this presentation. It's a really cool resource. It has like 5 things that will help teachers become more educated about counseling multiracial individuals, and I put the link up here. It's worth checking out. It's pretty short. It's an easy read. So if you have some time, I would definitely recommend that. And mixedheritage.org, it is just a wealth of information. It has links to all different kinds of things. I probably spent 2 hours on that site just kind of looking at all the different links and all the different educational resources that site offered. So I thought it was really good as well. So before I close and head to my resource slide, I wanted to just take a minute to talk about a couple personal takeaways from this project. My personal takeaway number 1 is that we don't at PBJHS offer support services for these students. I have never offered support services for these students. It's been something that's just never really crossed my mind, and now I know, and so that's something that I'm gonna make a change. I need to advocate for making that change at my school. It's something small that I can do that hopefully will make a difference, because we do have several multiracial individuals at our school, and probably several more that I don't even know about, just due to racial ambiguity. I just never have really considered even, hey, where are they from? The second thing that I learned is that, these feelings of guilt and, if I recognize my African American heritage, then I might be letting down my Native American heritage. These are real feelings that these individuals deal with, and so I feel like I certainly need to, help my clients to acknowledge those and not minimize those. So those are just a couple of my personal takeaways. I hope that this presentation has been helpful. I sure look forward to seeing the presentations that all of you created. So here are my resources, and I can't wait to see you guys in November. Have a great day.